In, I'm guessing the late 70s, Todd took over LMI, bought it, I think, from Tom Peterson. And what he did that had a tremendously significant effect was he changed the climate of Luthier, or he was instrumental in changing the climate from a secretive climate to a sharing climate. And he did that by creating the catalog he did. And if you've seen the LMI catalog, through the iterations over time, it went from a small but informative catalog. In other words, you saw materials, tools, etc. But with each material and tool, there was some Luthier's explanation for why it was interesting, why that wood might sound good, why a wood might have problems in terms of humidity or gluing. And then there would be just informative articles, how to French polish. And there hadn't been much like that. The Guild was getting traction about the same time, the Guild of American Luthiers. Their whole philosophy was sharing ideas. And so the change was really pretty dramatic. In the 60s, when I started, late 60s, if you asked somebody how they did something, they would either lie to you so that you wouldn't get any traction and become a competition, or they didn't know anything and they would lie to you because they didn't know anything. And so they would make something up. What the change meant was that the bullshit level dropped, the information level started climbing, and as it climbed and people shared ideas, the quality of work as well as the innovation level started just going crazy. Steve started doing really innovative work and coming up with ideas that were untried, pretty well untested, and he had to get through all that to make them work. And he was willing to go through all that. And he shared ideas. And the thing that I got from Steve, and that I'm really glad to share, is that it didn't have to be like everything we'd seen. None of these things, none of the innovations, none of the changes, none of the growth in any way negated what had been done before. So if you love the tone of a pre-war Martin Dreadnought, which has such a distinctive voice, it's a great tone. But at a certain point, why, if you're going to make guitars, why make that? Someone else is making that, namely Martin. So the notion that it didn't have to be like that was great. There's a big difference between being a guitar designer, a guitar maker, and a person who makes guitars because they're a woodworker. Those are three distinct categories that we see. The notion that a guitar designer is thinking about what constitutes an interesting guitar at every stage, whether it's an electric, an acoustic, a bass, an upright electric, a jazz guitar, whatever it is. It's thinking about the instrument and what its function is and how that all works. It's not designing to make it look a certain way. It's designing the way it works. Then there's the guitar maker who loves to make instruments, and they're primarily making guitars that exist already. Those are the Dreadnought makers, OM makers. We see primarily Martin copies, some Gibson copies, some of the big archtop guy copiers, people who are making guitars like D'Angelico, D'Acquisto. And then you get the people who shift, who started out as copiers and then they become innovators. Steve Grimes is a good example, in my opinion. Tom Bills. And then you get the people who are woodworkers who are making guitars. And they aren't thinking about them as guitars really at all. They know how big the bracing should be from pictures or from measuring inside guitars. Some of them make great guitars. I'm not saying they can't, but they tend to be very production oriented. Which again, if you're going to make a living at guitar making, you better be production oriented. And this is a philosophical thing. It has nothing to do with quality. It has nothing to do with right or wrong. But I just have no interest in almost any of the guitars I see. And it's not because they aren't terrific. And as a musician, I want to play a great guitar. But I'm more interested in thinking about guitars. And if I had a series of buttons that I could push, and guitars would pop out with the ideas that I had, I would do that. And when I've had the opportunity to design for other companies where I can sort of do that, I can design something and then hear a whole bunch of that design, to hear whether it's the design that's working or the craft that's working to make it work. That's a cool experience for me. And I know a lot of guitar makers think that's just an appalling idea because you're not making it then. There's a tremendous proliferation of lack of knowledge. It's a weird thing, but most people, as I said, don't think about how guitars work. They think about what somebody's done and they want to either do something different or they parrot what they've heard and been told. I had a good guitar maker tell me that I was doing the multiple scale wrong. Now, he had done a couple of them. I had done a ton of them. And a friend of mine and I came up with the idea in the modern period, not a certain person who gets the credit for it, which is not going to go any further. Your idea is neither correct nor incorrect. You can put this bridge here, you can put it here, you can put it here. It's going to have a different effect. If you want to move the top in the most tympanic way, putting it in the center makes a lot of sense. If you have more angle here, one of the things you get is more variation on what you can do with your bass, which I think is a cool thing. So the notion that somebody would say it's wrong strikes me as just kind of silly. One of the downsides of being a designer and who builds one-offs, which I tend to do, is that you don't get to hear a lot of the same idea to see whether that idea is working. If it works, then I try and keep what I think is working, try something else. If that doesn't work, like that guitar, if I don't think it works, then I have to try and figure out why it doesn't work. So I keep working on it until it works. It's a logical idea, in my opinion. If something's not working, try and adjust it. If you try it over and over and over and it still doesn't work, you may as well abandon it. Start another idea. Greg Smallman, Australian guitar maker, says that his guitars never sound good to him when he finishes them, and that he always messes with them afterward. What surprised me is that he doesn't put an access panel on, and he won't. And we had an argument about it because I'm thinking, the guitars are so radical. Why not put an access panel on? Who's he going to offend? But he found that a problematic thing, putting an access panel on. But back to this guy. Your idea of putting the bridge in the center makes perfect sense. And if you want to have a multiple scale that feels like a normal guitar back here, if you tend to play in your open positions mostly, which I do, you can have all of the angle down here if you want. I had someone tell me, well, you shouldn't do that because then it doesn't sound right when you pick. Well, of course it sounds right. It sounds the way you want it to sound. Right is not, there is no objective right or wrong. They're guitars. Just as an aside, people are getting very scientific about designing, but they're leaving out the single most variable part, which is wood. The second most variable part, which is people's taste. So the notion that they're going to make a guitar that's better, all they're going to do is make a guitar that has more of something, because they're quantifying. And it's not bad. Quantifying is good. Let's learn about it. Let's use that information. But the notion that it is somehow Making a better guitar is something I would dispute. It's making a more quantifiably understandable guitar, which is good. But better for you may not be better for you. And I was feeling stale as a designer. And so I started changing the whole way I thought about designing. And I stopped using a pencil and paper. And I started designing using Photoshop and Word. And weirdly enough, Word works great for doing some design stuff because you can't use the word part, but you can use the drawing part. And the same thing with Photoshop. You can use things that are inherent in the programs. But if you're going to design on the computer, you have access to a whole lot of fun stuff. This one has some really fun ideas in it, I think. One of them is the side slots. The side slots came about from a combination of thinking about Frank Gehry, the architect, and whoever it was that designed the JBL Paragon speaker system. The idea of curves and planes that were incongruous, and that's why this inner curve is not all parallel. On the other hand, I couldn't figure out how to use that kind of architecture on a guitar and make it work. So I didn't go too far that direction. But the other thing is actually an acoustic issue, which is the JBL Paragon speaker from the 60s, in which the cabinet had this big curved thing, and then the speakers were back inside there, and everything came off and reflected off this big curve. And if you've ever heard one, they're just great sounding. And the one thing that works on this guitar for me is these slots. And they really do a weird thing that I don't know how to describe, of moving the sound from here to here. It just spreads the sound out. At any rate, I had no idea what it was going to sound like or feel like. This is the first guitar I designed thinking about it from an aesthetic standpoint. I knew I wanted to design something that was not like anything else I'd done. And as it turns out, it has a voice that I'm not happy with. And so it goes. So I've been revoicing it. But a lot of other people have liked it more than I do. I don't know what to think about that. If somebody else plays it and likes it, but I don't like it, maybe I should stop worrying about it and let them like it. But I'm still not happy with it. I can do that because it has an access panel. And so I can just reach in and I can revoice it with the strings on. You can see with the access panel, you can go in and adjust braces, do repairs, put electronics in, and do all that stuff without having to cut holes in the guitar. So I can revoice it with the string tension on and hear the change in 5 minutes. And even I have a 5-minute memory. I'm becoming more and more like a goldfish, where I think I'm going to pretty soon have like a 3-second memory. Now, what were we talking about? Anyway, this is an idea from Abe Wechter. Abe Wechter, really interesting designer and builder, worked for Gibson and designed stuff for John McLaughlin. So anyway, the access panel, if nothing else gets out there, why doesn't everybody put an access panel on their guitar? I did a talk about this at the Guild convention, and the talk was called Why Weld the Hood Shut? You're going to build the thing. You wouldn't have your car tuned up, do the cards, injectors at this point, get the whole thing running just perfectly, and then just weld the sucker shut so that you'd never mess with it again. It's just a comical idea. Since I was doing a bolt-on neck, and I was doing that because I had done a lot of repairs where I had to do resets. Resetting a neck is a nightmare. If you have a bolt-on neck, it's a 15-20 minute job instead of a 4-hour job. I reset the neck on that guitar that I made in '75. I reset it took me about 20 minutes. If it had been a dovetail, it would have been 4 hours and it would have broken the guitar up. Anyway, but that led to this idea. And even before I put the binding on the outside, I was framing in the neck, because this doesn't actually touch the body. It floats there on pivot points so that the neck is adjustable through the access panel with the strings up to tension. You can adjust the neck. Not the curvature, but the action. The neck pivots on 2 points up here, which allows for adjusting yaw, and then an adjustable point down here, which is all adjustable through the access panel. And I put the frame around it really just because I don't like seeing that gap, but there is in fact a gap there. One thing I do believe is that you want to keep the saddle height relative to the bridge thickness. Let me rephrase that. You don't want to keep it anywhere, but you want to be able to adjust that for tone. That's a tremendously effective thing for controlling the attack onset of the note and the sustain and the blend of notes, the kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Whether the chords coalesce, which is really nice if you're singing, or whether they're very separate, which you really like if you're doing fingerstyle. And those are controlled, that function is very much a function of this angle and the relationship of this bone, of whatever's sticking up relative to the thickness of the rest. And, you know, that's just, it's a common sense thing, but it's also just empirically over time that turned out to work. The relationship of the saddle height above the wood has a lot of an effect on how sharp the attack of the note's going to be, of how much the notes will blend. A single saddle will blend more than individual saddles. A taller saddle will have a more radical attack. And part of that has to do with the torquing effect. Part of it has to do with the relationship of the mass of bone to wood. But if you want a lot of blend, which singers usually like, then a lower amount of bone and more of it, a thicker piece of bone but very low, and a taller amount of wood will give you that blend. And the opposite will give you more separation, individual saddles, etc. When I came up with this idea, and this is one that I think is actually mine, that you can play all the way up the neck, but you don't have to take a big chunk out of the body. So in other words, you can maintain the amount of cubic inches of airspace that you think it should have. And I call that a demi-cutaway. The multiple scale fretboard, that's something that we're seeing a lot of. The idea came from a friend of mine, John Sterrett, who was designing an instrument that was a tapping instrument. And when he and I came up with it together, he came up with the basic idea, and then we implemented it together. We didn't know that there was an instrument from the 1600s called an orpharion that used multiple scale fretwork. If you can imagine it as a guitar, kind of a shrunk down, what I was thinking of, and I didn't think of the design, I didn't think of the shape. I thought of what I wanted to do with structure. And so I started thinking, okay, there's a certain logic, in my opinion, to a bigger bass side than a treble side. And so I shifted the center line over towards the treble. So you can see this is the bass side's about an inch bigger than the treble side. And that shifted the neck line over about a degree plus whatever. And once that happened, then everything kind of went out the window. The bracing wasn't going to work. Previous brace designs I've been doing, even though I had a sound hole in the middle on the very first one. So I just started rethinking the bracing. And for what it's worth, I can't say that I know that it's better. I tend not to use terms like better or best. But what I think is it's a different voice. And it's almost inevitably a different voice. However, that said, I built an asymmetrically shaped pair of guitars at the same time. They were both spruce redwood half and half tops. And they were both the same spruce and same redwood because, of course, I had an extra piece since I didn't use it on that side. So they were very, very similar. And the backs, I don't have one here. The backs and sides of them were from Brazilian rosewood from a table I had cut up. It was a living room table. So in terms of woods, they were virtually identical. Design-wise, they couldn't have been more different. Multiple scale versus standard scale, asymmetry versus symmetry, double sound holes versus a single sound hole, and yet they sounded remarkably similar. I think what I learned from that was not that the wood was the be-all, end-all, although certainly the wood had a huge amount of effect, but that no matter what I was doing visually with the design, I was after a certain kind of voice, so I was going to build towards that voice. It's both frustrating because if you change something radically, you might get a radically different voice. And yet, it's very difficult not to keep being yourself. So you start trying to design something and hear a completely new voice. You may or not like that voice. You may design an instrument thinking you're going to have a completely different voice, and you end up with a guitar that sounds very much like what you were building before you redesigned everything. I believe in the idea of sharing ideas, so I don't patent things. There are a lot of people that are patenting like crazy, and it's fine. I like the people who patent and then give it to the community still. They just patent it so that people recognize that they came up with it. I have a feeling that we hit the critical mass point almost 10 years ago. And now, partly because of the economy, partly because there are so many builders and so many schools, that the competition has come back into the field. Where prior to then we had largely gotten rid of that and created a more knowledge and sharing-based economy within Lutherie. And I say economy because there's always a currency involved. The currency in Lutherie had become largely sharing ideas and sharing what people felt had worked and why they thought it worked. Why something might have been a better method, a structural improvement, a bracing idea, an aesthetic idea, or a tone that had not been heard before. The combination of the super easy access to parts, not necessarily to materials, but parts, and the internet led to a phenomena which I think is not terribly healthy. It shares the stage with a healthy idea. The healthy idea being that everybody has access to a tremendous amount of information. The unhealthy part is that we also have tremendous access to tremendous amounts of misinformation. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. That was a New Yorker cartoon. And the notion that on the internet, you have to already know a lot to separate what people do and don't know. And if you don't do that, if you can't do that, if you're starting out, everything coming at you, all the information coming at you, is coming at you with equal velocity and with equal force. So a completely half-assed idea from a luthier who's never built an instrument is coming at you with the same impact as somebody who's built for 50 years, who really knows what they're doing. And so to see, I find it frustrating to watch somebody as brilliant as, say, Eugene Clark, who was one of the first generation builders, getting the same impact in a way as somebody who literally doesn't know what they're talking about and is demonstrably wrong about everything they're putting up on the web. I find that difficult. Now, the one thing that might be interesting is because there's such great misinformation, somebody may have taken it, putting all this wrong stuff together and coming up with something wonderful. So in other words, if I had had a point, I would have been wrong. Luckily, I don't have a point. And so I think the most interesting guitar making is happening in Europe. And I'm looking forward to us reflecting some of that, seeing the kind of work that's being done there and realizing that we don't have to keep making dreadnoughts and primarily building as commerce. Scientific building is giving us quantifiable stuff. But we have to keep in mind that as of now, and I think in the near future, no luthier will ever put a man on the moon. And we need to keep reminding ourselves what we're doing, which is hopefully making instruments that are musically interesting, that are fun, and that lead one to play music in a more interesting and fun way. And I'm on a lifelong get poor quick scheme, and I'm doing great. I am able to make almost nothing. If I had any advice, which I'm loath to do, that advice would be build for fun, don't build to make a living. It's a terrible way to make a living, and it's a really fun way to live.